Hello, everyone. Good afternoon from the UK. Good morning to colleagues on the North American continent, and good evening to those of you to the east of us in UK and Europe. Welcome to day 2 of the 7th annual Liberal Arts, 7th annual GALA conference, Liberal Arts for Tomorrow. My name is Ian Gadd. I'm the academic director for GALA. Just before we start this session, some quick housekeeping for those of you who have been here at previous sessions. You will know the drill, but just for anybody who's new, we're recording the sessions, and we are uploading those to a folder that we will share with all the conference attendees until the end of October. So if you've missed any sessions or you want to go back and listen again, you'll be able to do so. We've been using the Zoom chat during all of the panels, so feel free to drop any comments or questions in as we go. I think particularly for panel discussions, I think that can be really useful, where we've got several speakers. We, as you all know, we have about an hour. We will start the next session in 56 minutes, so we'll aim to end about 10 to the hour or thereabouts. So apologies if you don't get to your question in the discussion time. We're also going to try and save a bit of time with introductions. So I'm going to give a very brief introduction of our 3 panelists today, and then paste their biographies into the chat window so you can review those. But I want to say, first of all, that this is a panel that I consider to be kind of an embodiment of what GALA does best, which is it started as an idea from one colleague, Shilpa at the National Institute of Design, who wanted to put together a panel that was comparative in its focus. And from there, we circulated her questions and brought together 2 other colleagues from 2 other GALA institutions to reflect on the same issue. So it's going to be a kind of organic panel. I think it's going to be really interesting and exploratory, and I'm hoping we'll get some good discussion afterwards. So just to introduce them each in turn, Dr. Shilpa Das is Principal Faculty Interdisciplinary Design Studies at the National Institute of Design in Ahmedabad in India. Dave Pabellon is an Assistant Professor of Graphic Design at Columbia College, Chicago, and is a design consultant as well. And Karol Murlak is a design researcher educator who is a professor at the Pratt Institute in New York, where he's joining us at the moment, but also an assistant professor at the School of Form in Warsaw, which is part of the SWPS University of Social Sciences and Humanities, is a GALA partner. So those are the 3 speakers, and that's the order that they will speak in. Each of them has slides, and we're going to explore for the next 45 minutes or so the value of the liberal arts in online design education in light of the pandemic. So over to you, Shilpa, and I'll cut and paste the biographies into the chat.
Thank you, Ian. I'll just share. Are you able to see my slides, everybody? Okay. So just wanted to start by wishing everyone, saying hello, and a special greeting, of course, to Ian and my fellow panelists, Dave and Karol. So as we know, a liberal arts education is a great sensitizer to an enabler of social justice, inclusion, and equality, and propounds a society that's based on these principles. And the education system anywhere in the world must aim to benefit all students so that no student loses any opportunity to learn because of circumstances of birth or background. When we use the term inclusion, we mean all kinds of students, who may be excluded from the current time. So if we are speaking in the South Asian context, where I am, those in remote areas with poor connectivity, those with little or no resources to participate in online learning, or those who may be living with joint families in cramped accommodation with no separate place for joining in class. But today, in this session, I focus on disabled students. So reports by various international national agencies indicate how the ongoing pandemic has impacted education, and a record number of children and youth, as we know, especially girls and also disabled students, have been disproportionately impacted because schools, colleges closed due to the pandemic, and many may never ever return to education at all. We have seen teachers and students embracing new learning environments and tools, and we have seen how powerful playful approaches to stimulate learning can be. And it looks like, in some sense, online teaching learning is here to stay in some avatar or the other. In a sense, e-learning actually has the potential to enable disabled people to participate in teaching learning process from their home without exposing themselves to pandemic risks. Indeed, it took a pandemic for the world to adopt the study solutions that disabled people have long since fought for. And this is called reasonable accommodation, which basically simply means necessary and appropriate adjustments without imposing any undue burden on a particular case, to ensure that people with disabilities exercise the rights of equally with others. For years, they missed out due to poor access, and suddenly they find themselves able to take part in work, culture, or socializing from their own homes. But lack of inclusive information and awareness of online tools, their inbuilt assistive solutions, and the available alternatives inevitably resulted in exclusion of disabled students. And educational institutions, while rapidly transitioning to online mode, needed to build in frameworks of accountability on the basis of a rights-based approach and equity. So inclusive education basically aims at increasing participation and removing systemic exclusionary barriers, because disabled students ultimately belong to the larger category of students. And the recommendations for this are what you see at the bottom of the slide: accessible infrastructure and so on and so forth. So having said that, we must recognize that the disabled community is also a heterogeneous community. A one-size-fits-all approach will not work. So the issues faced by students with a specific disability may not be similar to those faced by another student from the same category. And as part of the liberal arts program at the institute I come from, the National Institute of Design, I've been speaking to disabled students for years, but especially since the pandemic started, to understand the problems and challenges they apprehend did with the online learning mode. So let me share some of these insights with you very briefly with respect to hearing and learning disability. So this is what, a student I was speaking to with a hearing impairment had to say. And basically the few things that the student is saying in here with reference to online learning is that, one, Google Meet captioning helps make better sense of what the teacher is saying. So Zoom does not have a captioning facility. Two, group work and the noise of high frequency that results is jarring for students with hearing disabilities, especially those who may be using an aid. And three, they should be able to interact with the teacher separately. So here's what another student had to say. And here she's talking about how she has to rely on lip movement and how she has to ask the speaker to repeat what he or she said again and again. And she hesitates to say that. It is embarrassing. And she says, I'm slower in grasping information when more people talk simultaneously. So basically, in her narrative, she was talking about the emotional and physical labors of seeking access. And I actually did rather in-depth interviews with many of my students. So these tips, helped us in general while communicating with our students with hearing disability. The light, for example, must fall on their face. Poor lighting can cause shadows on the face of the talker. Conversely, we have to avoid strong lighting from behind, because such as which may cause difficulty for them to be able to lip read, see and interpret what you are saying. We have to avoid talking too rapidly or using sentences that are too complex. So you need to slow down, pause between sentences or phrases, and enunciate slowly what you mean. So on and so forth, and there is a reduced tolerance for loud sounds, which is not uncommon. Then we spoke to students with specific disabilities such as dysgraphia, dyscalculia, and dyslexia. And they have specific challenges. These processing problems that students face can interfere with learning basic skills like reading, writing, and or math, and can also interfere with higher level skills such as organization, time planning, abstract reasoning, long or short-term memory, and attention. So we figured out that typically, there are 5 general areas where difficulties are seen in terms of spoken language, the written language, arithmetic, reasoning, and memory. So these difficulties may manifest in aspects of the student's functioning, such as what you can see. Like, so behavioral, for example, can lead to mood swings, difficulty in making decisions, impulsive behavior. And this is what different have told us. Academic rehearsals in reading and writing. Some students said they had difficulty with sequencing tasks, inability to follow multiple instructions. And then, so basically reading gained further importance because reading is an all-pervasive activity throughout the student's academic life. Again, it was important for us to understand that no individual will have all the symptoms, and almost everyone has some symptoms or the other. This particular, the student kept out of the stressed one. She wanted to cry many a time. And he said, no matter how much I try hard and gather the courage to speak up, I just end up tattered. And it's difficult for others to understand how I can talk normally on one-on-one, but how I may get anxious in a presentation. So dyscalculia has its own issues. Dysgraphia has its own challenges. This particular student with dysgraphia said that nobody asks a person with a hearing impairment, why can't you hear? But to someone with dysgraphia, it's often asked, why can't you get the spellings right in the chats, for example? So with that, I think, I would like to say that, reading, a student said that reading helps. It helps when teachers make an active effort to acknowledge and look into the needs and issues that students with disabilities may face. And rather than treating it as a sort of hack, to get into an institute by brandishing a learning disability certificate, or a sly way to get extra time during the exams, which has been the case in every other institute I've been in. So this is where, reasonable accommodation that I mentioned earlier becomes important. I know that there is a lot of text on these slides, but since this will go into the recording, people will be able to read. So to conclude, I think I would like to say that as teachers, we must understand ourselves as agents with the skills, power, and responsibility to alter existing arrangements in our own epistemic cultures and epistemic communities, as responsible for and committed to designing a more meaningfully accessible and inclusive academic community. quite like design methodology, which reveals that design processes are often iterative and recursive, doubling back on themselves to integrate new ways of knowing and making. So access is a beginning, not an endpoint, and it's a long-term commitment to do better. We did all kinds of hybrid modes along with the online mode, but that is something that we can discuss if somebody has a question later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Shilpa. Thank you. Lots of great detail there. Let's press straight on, and then we'll have a general discussion at the end. So, Dave, do you want to take the floor?
Happy to do so. Thank you. Can everybody see this opening slide?
That looks like a very messy floor.
It is. My portion of this discussion is going to be a little bit more casual and loose, but I wanted to give you a little bit of a framework of my contribution to the conversation by starting off by sharing research and application of peace circles into the studio and seminar environment. A peace circle is a restorative justice model that, like other restorative justice practices, can be used to address conflict holistically and solve problems. The phrase restorative justice has appeared in written sources since the first half of the 19th century. The modern usage of the term was introduced by Albert Eglash, who in 1977 described 3 different approaches to justice. Retributive, based on punishment, with like the criminal justice system. Distributive justice, involving therapeutic treatment of offenders, similar to social services. And restorative justice, based on restitution with input from victims and offenders. What Ian had mentioned is a messy floor, and it's the remnants of practice, of circle practice that had been conducted in 2019 as part of a senior seminar that fused together a couple of different pieces of context and content. The senior seminar class at Dominican University, the topic is ethics, and so we used the textbook Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics as the basis, and then I crossed it or overlapped it with the circle process, which is this very time-based long form of discussion and debate. The peacemaking circle is a process that brings together individuals who wish to engage in conflict resolution, healing, support, decision-making, or other activities in which honest communications, relationship development, and community building are core desired outcomes. The third thing I overlapped on top of the circle practice, Aristotle's Ethics, was the visual context, which we were all working towards, which is the hanging and exhibition of the long term. And the long term is a group exhibition that I was a part of and helped organize onto campus. It is visual responses made by incarcerated people from Stateville Prison, right outside of the Chicagoland area. And it was all in response to the kind of, I would just say, how unjust long-term sentencing in Illinois is. Essentially, in the 80s, there was legislation that was passed that would judge people with multiple offenses to these exponentially long forms of sentencing that had no kind of appeal process. So if you say you were involved with a violent act and you were 25 and you had a previous, you immediately would get a 40+ year sentence. And so this entire show was based around not just data responses, like actually looking at like how it affects the economy by keeping people incarcerated for that long, but also the psycho and mental physical effects that long-term incarceration does to those that are involved, not just those within, but the family members that are affected outside of that. This is a very heavy topic to kind of bring up To students, most students didn't have an access point, and those that did have access points to incarcerated people had a feeling of shame that they didn't want to share, that was part of their family lineage. And so the circle practice was a really easy, I wouldn't say easy, but it was a very sensitive process to allow these conversations to happen. And the way that the circle process works is that we sit in circle and there's a hierarchical flattening that happens within the classroom. No longer am I the lone kind of head speaker or instructor, but every person in the class has an opportunity to share. And so that became the way that we communicated and gave critiques and discussed readings about Aristotle and about long-term sentencing in the state of Illinois. At the end of the semester, I invited the students, which were a majority art majors, but then some general ed students too, because it was a seminar for all seniors to participate in contributing to the exhibition and making their own visual responses. And so these are two examples. One, this is a group of graphic design majors that produced a visual and literal interpretation of the weight of waiting. And so they measured how much each brick weighed and then converted each gram to a day. And so they measured grams to days. And so this is like the weight of waiting. And this is like it converted into time. A group of fashion design majors decided to produce garment, during that calendar year. Virgil Abloh's show, the Off-White designer, was at the MCA, and they wanted to discuss the kind of appropriation of like cultural garments or incarcerated garment into fashion. And so how those are read and like the assumptions that are made when you just see the bright hue of orange. So that year ended, I made a very difficult decision to switch institutions, and I did so in the middle of a pandemic. And it also halted the way that I taught that class, or the way that I wanted to bring circle practice into the classroom. As many of y'all know, sometimes teaching online is difficult when the room goes to black. And so this is just an interpretation of sometimes how it feels like to teach in a classroom where you're the only one that's showing face. And so you make these assumptions of like where people are coming from, why isn't there engagement? How can I build that community that was happening in this kind of enclosed safe space of peace circles into the online environment? And I was able to, I don't know if this is actually advisable, but I did it within my own studio practice or studio education practice. I took a la carte some of the parts and pieces of community building that I would do in Peace Circle and then apply it to online communication. So in every single one of my studios, I would have a check-in and check-out, which is the same way that we open and close circle practice, which allowed people to give voice. Because I was noticing that I would go weeks at a time without one student or like one of those black boxes ever speaking up or adding to the chat. So it gave an opportunity, at least to start or open class, that they felt like their voice was being heard or they're participating in the conversation. Now that we're back in person, at least in Chicago, knock on wood that it stays that way. I'm bringing circle practice back into my long form studios, and this is a class that I'm teaching for senior level graduating seniors in branded environments. And I still do work with Prison and Neighborhood Arts Project that produced the long term, but I invited this semester 2 traveling exhibitions, As Not For, produced by Jerome Harris, which is a, is an incomplete historical survey of work created by African-American graphic designers over the last century. The selected designers utilize modernist and Bauhausian methods or more intuitive techniques to create work that ranges from commercially accessible design to avant-garde graphic design and experimentation. These practitioners are and still are absent in too many classrooms and lectures. So I thought this was an opportunity to bring the exhibit in, but also expose these graduating seniors to a lot of narratives that they might not have been exposed to in their 4 years previous to graduating. This is also a very difficult conversation because when I opened enrollment, I didn't have one Black student enroll. They didn't know what the course was going to be about, but I also felt like this is a really good opportunity to create a safe space to talk to non-Black design students about the absence of Black designers or the absence of designers of color in general. And so instead of just saying, here's some research paper, tell me what you think, I wanted to talk about the lived experience and how it informs their design decisions. This has just started, I'm only in week 3, but the second project is part of an organization that I'm a part of as a core organizer. The Design is Protest Collective. We just produced this oversized 16-page broadsheet that goes over the Anti-Racist Design Justice Index and the Design Justice Demands. Both of those 2 pieces of research are going to help fuel ways that the industry can change in regards to oppressive behavior in the built environment. So the fodder for the second project that's going to happen later in the semester is going to be a visual response to these 9 demands that DAP has put together. And we'll be producing a branded environment in somewhere in XY locations in the city of Chicago. Again, the circle practice is a way to get this conversation started without it just being like a point of interest for Dave's class. Like, Dave's interested in these things, he's making me do this. Instead, I want them to talk about their experiences, whether it's the absence of designers of color in their kind of education, in the way that they work or whom they've worked with, or just being aware that these kind of forms of oppression happen everywhere that they look. And so, yeah, the Peace Circle process has helped me kind of formulate these kind of harder subjects and bring them into the studio environment. Thank you.
Many thanks, Dave. Really interesting. There's some interesting, unexpected connections with what Shilpa was talking about in terms of students' lived experience and that sense of shame in certain cases. Let's head straight on to Karol, and so over to you.
So hello, everyone. Let me just share my screen. I hope you can see it now. Can you see it now? Yep. Okay. So I guess in this particular meeting, I need to call myself a practitioner in that sense that I probably represent the most hands-on experience, both in my own practice, but also in my teaching style. I think I need to introduce a bit the topic that I'm really interested in, and the topic that is kind of the common thread of all classes that I teach. So I'm a designer interested in materiality, interested in materials, designing new materials, applying new materials, but also a designer interested in sensory perception of materials. Like, both technical side of it is very interesting to me, but also this very the experience, generally speaking, of that is also something that I not only am focusing in my own teaching and my own design and research practice, but also in my teaching. And my classes, both at Pratt Institute and SWPS University, are centered around materiality. I teach different classes. So I teach some theory-based classes like design research or thesis formulation, or even thesis project that are centered a bit more about theory. But the core classes that I teach, and the classes I would like to focus on today, are actually design studios and sponsored projects. So those classes are the classes where the classroom doesn't look like a classroom most of you probably know, but they actually look more like workshops or artist studios, meaning that students, the entire teaching process is centered around making. And that making is not only a way to present the project, but it's rather a way to develop and discover what the student wants to make. So the making is embodied in the entire teaching process from day one to very last classes. When I say making, I also mean testing. So building prototypes of things that later are tested by a student, their peers, and also external stakeholders. And the feedback from those people is actually essential for the further development of those projects. So this is how my life looked like till February 2000, and then pandemic came, and of course all of that became super complicated. And I'm not representing only myself here, I'm representing a big group of my colleagues at both sides of Atlantic Ocean who had to radically change the way they teach to still achieve learning goals, but at the same time to adopt to a very new environment. And that new environment was very often a kitchen or a bedroom of houses where students stayed. So I would like to share, I guess, 5 main discussions we had, and 5 main things we've learned over this two semesters, or almost 3 semesters so far. The first discussion, the big discussion we had, was should we encourage students to do rapid prototyping, so to use 3D printers to make models, or should we rather choose a different way for them to experience 3-dimensional objects? And after those 3 semesters, I'm 100% sure that actually rapid prototyping is not the way to go. Much better way to do things is just DIY prototypes. And we were looking for precedents. We were looking for those situations where we could show our students it's not something new. People did it before. And actually, now when I start my classes, very often I actually show this picture. It comes from the book that some of you may know. It's called 10 Faces of Innovation by Tom Kelly from IDEO. And actually, long before anyone could imagine a pandemic, authors describe that process of very quick prototyping, where you don't have any resources. You are during the meeting with your client in client's office, and you need to kind of start a conversation about the particular shape. And he showed this particular piece, which is a handle to a medical equipment. I don't remember what type of medical equipment this is, but generally speaking, he's saying that just using a marker and a bit of sticky tape and some other things that were found on the desk, the designer was able to kind of mimic the shape to help people understand the scale, the proportions, and so on. This is usually how I start talking about DIY models, like the models you sometimes need to make in your kitchen, showing that rather as an opportunity, not a disadvantage. So the ability to build such a simple model is actually an extra skill, I believe, rather than a problem. In my pedagogy, this DIY models, like quick mockups, actually replaced rapid prototyping almost completely. If rapid prototyping is used, I would rather say is used for the final result, just to make like a beautiful 3-dimensional object, because this is what our students really need at the end of that design process. I don't even maybe need it that much as an educator, but they need it as creators and people participating in the process. The second discovery was actually discovering that amazing skill that students have to actually perceive and assess their own work with their own hands. So usually how this process looked like before was just like me taking a model, a prototype, holding it and showing like this part is not working well, look how it responds to my hand, or how my back leans when I sit on this chair. So this was the experience we had so far. And actually, it made a lot of sense because, as you all know, designers are not designing for themselves. They actually design for others. So they should learn how to evaluate their projects and how to make sure they work for as many people as possible. But actually, we discovered that if we train empathy, the student is able to kind of imagine the user, even if it's the student testing the object. So the own sensory perception of a student can be a very powerful tool if we actually train that. This speaks a bit to previous speakers as well, you know, that methodology. The third thing that changed for better, and I didn't even realize that that's a case, is actually that instant access to the endless resource of precedences and cases when you teach online. So usually I have a lecture, I show a lecture with ready pictures, but I never have access to those pictures that I would show my students when they ask questions. Like, this is not the thing that a professor does. You just answer the question. You may ask a student to have a look at the precedent, like given title and author, a year, but you never actually open a picture because usually you are already in a different room with no projector, and, you know, like showing pictures on your phone doesn't feel like the most appropriate thing to do during this kind of individual credits or even group credits in the studio environment. Nowadays, when Zoom or Google Meet is our classroom, actually, whenever I need to show a picture of a specific project, I can just Google it and show it immediately. And actually, this makes the communication much easier. And also, those things that can't be checked by students can be actually experienced through other precedents that they can further explore. Another very practical thing that we discovered is that actually sketching and drawing over pictures of models is something that, like, it's another ability that we gained, and we didn't have it before pandemic. So usually when a student made a model, our feedback would be based on just holding the thing and kind of like showing how to change it, like make this longer, make this shorter, this needs a bit more volume. Nowadays, you can draw it. Like, you can take a picture of a model and immediately drawing, and that's another great tool that we gained. And finally, referring to objects that students already have at home. So classroom is very limited in that sense that, you know, there are desks there are tools, but if you, let's say, teach a class based on kitchen utensils, you have no access to kitchen utensils unless you bring anything. Now, when you teach such a class, every student has access to her own kitchen, so they can immediately just bring a utensil I want to discuss, let's say a fork, and we have 12 forks in 5 minutes. In the classroom, we can discuss about the shape, the feasibility, and so on and so forth. So honestly saying, after all that experience, I became a big advocate of online teaching. Even though it's such a different experience for students, I still think it's possible to keep on that hands-on experience, although technically speaking, hands of our students are off the material world and they're on keyboards. I guess the biggest challenge from my perspective is actually interaction. This was like the second pillar of my classroom, was interaction between students, formal and very informal interaction. And the solution to this problem, this challenge, is, I guess, still to be done. It's far more complicated. There's more and more digital tools. There are, of course, little tricks you can do in your classroom, but still, it's something that I don't feel is completely resolved. So being back in a classroom is actually fixing that problem for sure. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.